Corsair 7000D case is in for review now. This one comes after the 4000D and after the 5000D. So straight out of the gate, we already know that the 7000D is at least 40% better than the 5000D, which of course was already 25% better than the 4000D. So as Corsair adds more Ds to its cases, we assume they get better. In this instance though, mostly just larger and more expensive. So the 7000D is relatively large. It's at $260. It puts it in competition with the XL class of cases like the Lian O11 Dynamic XL, the Fractal Meshify 2 XL, Phanteks Enthoo Pro 2, things like that. There's a 7000X as well, and the 7000X is spectacularly expensive. That one is $330, so we're going to be reviewing those today to look at thermals and more. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermaltake and the Thermaltake ToughRAM XG memory. Thermaltake's ToughRAM XG series is a freshly updated line of RGB memory, available in frequencies ranging from 3600 MHz up to 4600 MHz. Thermaltake's ToughRAM XG uses 10-layer PCBs and heat spreaders affixed with bright LEDs everywhere, and they market toward overclocking support and capabilities. Learn more at the links in the description below. The first thing to talk about with the 7000D is definitely the pricing side of it, because at its price point, given that this is in an existing lineup of cases that look very similar to this one, Corsair is sort of competing with itself. There are features here that you don't get with the other ones. Those features are primarily afforded by the size. Water cooling features, for example, a lot of extra radiators. But then you also get things that are maybe not as necessary, like a door within a door, or a really heavy door, side panel door that is, I think it's almost 2 millimeters thick of steel. Anyway, there's some stuff you get that's useful and some stuff that, well, in this case is simply necessary by nature of the size, and then some things that aren't that useful. But in this case, the primary competition is going to be the 5000D, and that's $160. It's about $100 cheaper, current prices. And the 4000D Airflow is another competitor to this. That's $85. Thus far, with its new cases, Corsair's done pretty well. And the 4000D and 5000D Airflow versions got general recommendations from us. And it's a strong turning point from where Corsair was just up until recently, where it had become a meme generator of cases prior to this sort of revolution in the X1000D series. Other competitors to keep in mind while we go through this review, build notes, thermals, all that stuff, would be the Meshify 2 XL from Fractal. It's $180. We have a review on the channel if you're curious. The O11 XL, a bit older, but also around the same price points, and it fluctuates, 170 to 200-ish. And that would be a direct competitor as well, both a bit cheaper than this one or the Enthoo Pro 2 from Phanteks. A couple of the changes to this case versus, I really don't know where to put these. A couple changes for this case from the others. It's a piece of steel, by the way. You don't need to, don't cringe. The front panel looks the same. Top panel looks about the same other than size. So they're keeping the aesthetic and the functional aspects of it. It's still these sort of socketable ball joints. Come on. All right. Okay. All right. Sorry. So the primary difference in the front here is Corsair's gotten rid of some of the circular metal pieces of the mounting hardware for the fans. Previously, we complained that these were problematic if you changed the fans from, say, 120 to 140 mil. In this case, they've gotten rid of it. So already there's one of our complaints that's been solved because it looked a bit bad with RGB LEDs, and it also it's just blockages that don't need to exist. So those are gone. On the previous cases in this series, 140 mil fans looked misaligned and off-center because of that. In this one, it ships stock with 140 mil fans. So this is another change for the D series. These are 0.3 amp fans, 12 volts of course. There's room for a lot of them in here, although it ships with these three. We've got two in the front, biased a bit towards the CPU, and then one in the back. There is a vertical mount for the GPU. As usual, we generally advise not using those unless you're water cooling. More on that later. And beyond that, this case mostly is advantageous for water cooling, where you get extra height for tall radiators, extra length here for the same except at the top, and then your usual myriad appendages and sundries that come with water cooling cases, like radiator or reservoir pump mounts. So we're going to be looking at this. Let's go through the build section that Patrick worked on. We'll be going over thermals and acoustics as well as noise normalized thermals as usual. We'll talk about if it's actually worth it. As we've mentioned with multiple other Corsair cases, another way that the company tries to highlight the front fans is by eliminating any reinforcement in the front filter. This makes RGB fans look great, but it can lead to some sagging in the mesh, potentially to the point of contacting fan blades. We've seen that with other ones in the past. The filter frame is now thicker, lifting the nylon mesh away from the fan blades. This has the unfortunate side effect of blocking off the air gaps on the side of the front panel that the 7000X relies on for ventilation, meaning that the 7000X is a step backwards from the 5000X in terms of airflow. On that subject, the distance between the surface of the top filter and the top cover plate has been reduced from approximately 3 centimeters in the 5000 blank to approximately 1.6 centimeters in the 7000s. This is mostly irrelevant for the 7000D airflow, where the front and the top cover plates are ventilated, but in the tempered glass 7000X, it's actually a significant reduction in airflow. Given the 7000X's restrictions, it's a good thing that the 7000 case family has a side vent intake that can mount up to 4 120mm fans, although using that mount necessitates removing the cable bar. The stock fans are 140mm, so none of them can be shifted to the side mount. And after working on cases like the Lian O11 series, one of the side vent features that we've really come to appreciate is the magnetic filter resting precisely in the corner of the side panel. So there's little danger of the filter sliding around during installation and leaving an open air gap. Cable management is a mixed bag. As usual, Corsair has done an excellent job of placing plastic cable channels with big loops to fit Velcro straps, with 3 pre-installed and 6 extras. Finally, we can flex our fully blinged out Corsair D-Series Velcro strap necklace, or the Flexless, as we call it. It's a thing, it'll catch on. The tray has 3 centimeters of clearance from the side panel, just as advertised. Space for cables under the power supply shroud is limited if both hard drive cages are installed side by side, but each cage fits 3 drives, so even one cage can house more 3.5-inch drives than a typical mid-tower in today's times. Our main complaint is with the hinged metal door that encloses the cables, which is a returning issue from previous Corsair cases. The manual refers to this as, quote, motherboard steel hinged doors. Rather literal, but it differentiates it from other cable cover pieces in the case interior. A cable door is a good idea for this case and could help prevent the side from popping open. However, the cable door is big. It's also flexible, and it closes magnetically, meaning that cables have to already be bundled perfectly flat in order to shut the door. This renders it mostly useless. The side of the case is also opaque, so it doesn't make the system look any tidier. We'd recommend ditching the door completely and relying on the Velcro straps for cable management. It's an unfortunate waste of money. Obviously, this is passed on to the consumer at some level, so it's a bit of a waste of money for the consumer, but it just seems like there's always bits and pieces that go unused. The hard drive cages we just mentioned are one way in which the 7000D makes effective use of its size. Out of the box, the 2 cages are placed side by side under the power supply shroud, but each can be removed by taking out a single thumb screw, and the cages can optionally be stacked if the cable cover is removed. This is where we'd like to see Corsair have maybe considered including another drive cage, or maybe more focus or more cost invested in this feature, rather than something like that closing door behind an opaque panel that's sealed with magnets. This doesn't make any real sense, really. The tab used to fasten the cages to the bottom of the chassis is removable for easier stacking, but our biggest concern with these cages is that they fit loosely. This makes it great for easy installation, but they're hard drives, or most of the time they are. And that means that you're dealing with vibration noise and just vibration in general from mechanical drives. None of the drive sleds contain any rubber damping. You'll probably want to invest $1 or so in some rubber with glue on it and deal with that yourself. One of the best features of the 7000D is the amount of headroom above the motherboard. There's a ridiculous 9 centimeter gap between the top edge of the board and the roof of the case. This leaves a lot of space for fans and radiators. We'll talk about that more in a moment as well. Cable cutouts above the board are also large, but it would be nice if they were closer to the edge of the board, because the further down they are, the less chance that they'll be blocked by a radiator. And speaking of, radiator compatibility is listed as up to 480mm at the front, 420 at the top, and 480mm on the side, although the side mount is specifically limited to 120mm wide fans and radiators. Corsair's manual incorrectly lists maximum compatibility for this mount as 480 or 420mm. 420mm radiators are 140mm wide, despite the number being smaller than 480. It is wider, so that's wrong. It won't fit. As far as multi-rad configurations, Corsair only claims that 3 simultaneous 360mm radiators, top, front, and side, 2 simultaneous 420s, top and front, or a single 480 rad will fit. Installing items in the top mount limits the height of the other 2 mounts, and vice versa. The cutout at the front of the power supply shroud does allow for mounting large CLCs in the ideal tubes down orientation, if the tubes are long enough. To use the front and the side mounts simultaneously, it might also be necessary to use 120mm wide components on the front mount, and use the extra set of mounting rails to offset them towards the glass side panel. The steel panel is likely the heaviest we've ever seen, and it weighs almost as much as the e-waste that Dell's warranty comes with. This entire thing is constructed of 1.7mm thick steel with the intention of eliminating any warping. And it works. It's a very brute force method to preventing warping. The hinge knuckles are built from the same material, screwed securely into the steel side panel, and glued to the glass one. The tempered glass panel in our case sagged slightly so that the snaps at the front edge don't line up without help. The hinge pins are of unequal heights, but this is good because that makes it easier to install. And the tops of the pins are drilled and tapped so that the hinges can be screwed together. There's no way to screw the doors themselves shut, which is a feature we'd like to see for security while carrying a case that weighs about as much as our growing pile of e-waste from pre-built manufacturers, and also just as a way to mash unruly cables down. In total, the 7000D Airflow is listed as 18.7 kilograms, the 7000X is listed as 19.8 kilograms. The power supply filter deserves special praise, though, for ejecting to the side of the case. This is actually a very small but very good attention to detail feature. Accessing the rear of a gigantic case like this once it's built, especially if it's got water cooling in it, will be extremely inconvenient in most setups if it's anywhere near a wall. It's somewhat difficult to grab even through the side, since the case legs remain at the reduced 2 centimeter heights of the 5000D rather than the original 3 centimeter leg height of the 4000D, but this is still a good design overall. Maximum motherboard size is defined as EATX. There are no numbers describing what this means anywhere, including the reviewer's guide. There are no obstacles to wider than ATX boards, though, other than removing the cable bar, but there are also no standoffs beyond the standard ATX ones. So EATX support is essentially limited to the widest board that can be comfortably installed without an additional set of standoffs. The EVGX 299 Dark, for example. Also, EATX isn't real. It's not a form factor that exists, and it's not defined anywhere by any standards organization. It's made up. Corsair should be using SSI EEB or CEB, or most appropriately, the actual maximum size of the motherboard, and really it should have standoffs there too. Taking out the cable bar extension is necessary in order to access the cutouts along the edge of the motherboard. We found that since the extension is only fastened at the top and the bottom, it's prone to bowing out under pressure from the 24-pin ATX power cable. Taking out the main section of the cable bar is necessary when using the side mounts for fans or stacking hard drive cages, so we'd prefer to remove it as well. The whole cable bar, it's just cosmetic here. All the functional cable management is already done behind the motherboard tray, so you can ditch it without really losing much. A vertical GPU mount is built into this case. As a rule of thumb, as a reminder, we recommend only using this for vertical mounts when the GPU is liquid cooled. Corsair also includes a bracket to convert the 6 lowest horizontal expansion slots out of 8 total into vertical slots. That should have enough distance from the side panel to work well with some air-cooled cards, but with the ridiculousness of some of the 30 series cards where you're looking at 4 slots, you do get a little bit close to the glass, so keep that in mind. Corsair doesn't include a riser cable with the 7000D Airflow or with a $330 7000X, so that you'll need to bring. Front I/O includes a mic headphone jack that's combined at 3.5 millimeters. It has a USB Type-C port and 4 USB 3.0 Type-A ports. We're happy to see an extra large case like this get so many Type-A ports on the front panel too, because as we mentioned with the Cooler Master Frame 700 Master, the more inconvenient it is to access rear I/O, the more important front I/O becomes, like in this one. As with past cases, there's a plastic extension at the front of the PSU shroud that clips it into place and is fastened with a single captive thumb screw. It's a tight fit, and the extension wasn't snapped into place fully in our review unit, so it was bouncing around. In addition, the thumb screw had either been over-torqued or over-tightened at some point so that the plastic split. This is apparently a plague among case manufacturers where they over-torque a lot of the screws. Alternatively, there is a second plastic cover that simply caps off at the end of the power supply shroud. This cover is constructed in sections that appear removable. It doesn't have the split plastic, and we believe it's designed to give even more clearance to radiators or fans if necessary. Removing these sections requires snapping the plastic and is irreversible. Both shroud extensions are cosmetic and not functional, since the power supply should probably be installed fan down anyway. It makes a little difference whether the shroud is sealed or not. The 7000D Airflow was our focus for this review for thermal testing, as we knew right away that it's the model we're the most likely to recommend of the two. It's got better ventilation, and more importantly, it's cheaper, while offering largely the same set of features. Corsair agreed to send us the 7000X panel as well, so we did take the opportunity to simulate a 7000X by installing the tempered glass front panel, sealing the top panel, and moving all three 7000D stock fans to the front of the case, and installing a comparable 1200 RPM fan in the rear of the case, the NFP14. This isn't exactly the same as testing a 7000X, but it gives us a rough idea that's going to be close enough to better determine how the expensive case differs from the Airflow model. The 7000X's IQ SP140 RGB Elite fans are exactly the same as the 7000D's fans, except they have more shiny, more RGB. Corsair publishes build guides for its cases. For the 7000D and X, they've depicted 3 builds. Every one of these builds is set up in a negative pressure, rear intake, front exhaust, top exhaust, and side exhaust configuration. This is a valid choice, but keep in mind that the rear of the case isn't filtered, while the front, side, and top are. So you're pushing air out through the filter, and you're pulling air in without a filter, meaning that there's potential for more dust. The initial CPU results from our combined CPU and GPU torture workload with the stock 7000D Airflow was an average of 46 degrees Celsius above ambient. Removing the front panel brought that down to 45, not really significant, but only because of rounding here. The ventilated front panel just doesn't have that much of an effect on the CPU's temperature in our testing. By removing the front panel, what we really mean is that we removed the cover plate. The bezel and the filter were left in place. Simulating the 7000X brought the CPU up to 50 degrees average, 5 degrees hotter than baseline, and the restricted air gaps to the sides of the front panel aren't enough for it to breathe clearly. Swapping the 7000X front panel to the Airflow plate brought temperatures down to 44 degrees average, which is the best of both worlds. And part of that has to do with where you're allowing the air to exit. If the air exits out of the top before it ever gets to the CPU cooler, then it's not beneficial to the CPU cooler. Comparatively, an average of 46 degrees above ambient for the CPU puts the 7000D Airflow in a strong position compared to most of our chart, and that includes Corsair's own 4000D Airflow at 50 degrees and 5000D Airflow at 48 degrees. The 7000D's advantage is mostly in the quantity and size of its stock fans. We consider the Meshify 2 XL to be the 7000D's main competitor among the large cases we've tested, and at 49 degrees it fits in as a competitor. The Phanteks Enthoo Pro 2 is also a potential competitor, but it doesn't include any stock fans. The O11 XL is also a good and large case, but it doesn't have the same focus on supporting multiple extra long radiators and high numbers of 3.5-inch drives. The 7000D overall looks pretty good for a start. Baseline GPU temperature was 59 degrees Celsius above ambient, which was more affected by the removal of the front plate than the CPU was. That's down to 56 degrees average. Switching to the 7000X configuration involved installing another 140mm fan at the bottom of the front panel while leaving the upper 2 fans untouched, dropping the average to 53 degrees. With the Airflow plate and the 7000X fans, GPU temperature averaged 51 degrees. Lowest result yet. An average of 59 degrees is on the hot side of the chart, and in this instance, the 4000D Airflow's average of 52 degrees is an improvement over the 7000D Airflow. Comparatively, the Meshify 2 XL is also an improvement at 55 degrees. Adding an extra intake fan to the front panel to emulate the 7000X helped significantly, and we recommend doing so. As always, every build is different, so experimentation with the configuration is a good idea. Rendering our monkey head test scene on the CPUs in Blender resulted in a CPU average of 35 degrees Celsius over ambient. This is tied with the Silverstone RVO2 has one of the best temperatures on the chart for this test. With all three intake fans biased towards the top of the case, CPU cooling is obviously very good in this one. Our set of standardized fans includes two 140mm intake fans and one 120mm exhaust, which sounds like a step down from the three 140mm stock fans, but the standardized fans are also higher RPM. This test is the one highly requested by the audience, despite its imperfections, but we have a methodology piece explaining those so that you can make the best use of this data. CPU temperature dropped down to 44 degrees average, which puts the 7000 series alongside the P400A Digital for one of the best results measured in this test. We didn't alter the positioning of the fans from Corsair's chosen stock configuration, which helps explain why the CPU temperatures remained so good in this test, as well as why the GPU's 52 degree average in this test is more middling. But it's still tied with the Meshify 2 XL and the 5000D Airflow. Given the right fans and the right arrangement, the 7000D Airflow is a well-ventilated case overall. The quantity of stock fans and the open front panel design also means that the 7000D Airflow is loud with the case fans at maximum speed. The noise level measured at 46.7 dBA at our standardized 20-inch test distance. It's in the same audible range as the loudest cases we've tested thus far. The Meshify 2 XL scored 38.7 dBA in this test, and that's a reduction in noise that's definitely audible. Bringing the 7000D Airflow down to 36 dBA for the threshold we use for noise normalized testing required setting the case fans to about 730 to 750 RPM for the reported speed. CPU temperature climbed to 50 degrees Celsius above ambient, which is still an excellent result. The Meshify 2 XL averaged 53 degrees in the same test, while the 4000D Airflow was even warmer at 55 degrees. GPU temperature only worsened slightly. Comparative performance is the inverse of the CPU result, with the 7000D Airflow landing among the worst results in this category, as did the 5000D. Careful balancing of the intake fans is a good idea here, especially if the case fans aren't set to blast at 100% speed at all times. The 7000D Airflow is a big and expensive case, so this is a specific market. We would say it's sort of like backwards approach, where typically you'd come into the market with your really expensive product and then release the lower end ones later, so that people who looked at this said, wow, I really want that, couldn't afford it or justify it, will then buy the cheaper version of it that looks similar later. But you still extract maximum sales out of the launch of this one. So in this case, it's happened backwards, where the 4000D came out first. And the 4000D right now, current prices at time of filming, $85. That leaves some budget for extra fans or specializing the hardware that you have in the case. It's a much more reasonable entry for a case of its quality, whereas this you get into diminishing returns. The 5000D itself is pretty pricey at $160. That is on the higher side from what people tend to spend on cases. It does have improvements over the 4000D. They are probably easier to justify at the $160 price than the improvements here at the $200 plus $260 price. So the 5000D in terms of mid-towers is your most sensible alternative to this one if you really don't need the size of this case and the radiator support of this case. With that said, the 7000D Airflow does provide some features that users may specifically want. If you want to install 6 hard drives, more if Corsair sells the cages, or install 3 360mm radiators for an open loop, the 7000D is one of the few cases that provides a platform for that. We find Fractal's Meshify 2 XL at $180 to be the wiser investment for functional features like this, since the XL has standoffs for motherboards even larger than SSI EEP, which would be called EATX in their listing. The Meshify 2 XL also has extra hard drive trays that are easily available for a maximum capacity of 18 3.5-inch drives. On the other hand, the Meshify 2 XL supports fewer large radiators simultaneously, and then that leaves the opinion of looks, which we will leave that up to you. If you prefer one over the other, cool. It's just looks, so it doesn't really matter what we think. But in terms of performance, both cases include 3 140mm fans. They can both be made to perform well. Corsair's stock fans are higher RPM. They cool a little bit more effectively, and when noise normalized or standardized in any way, it's doing pretty well. So this case, build quality is overall what we would call good. The construction is pretty good. There are a lot of unnecessary components to this case that you will be paying for, but the construction of them minimally is good. The 7000X, we don't recommend at all. We would give it a negative recommendation here. It makes so much more sense to buy almost anything else, especially at that price point. You're 300 plus, there's every option available to you for the most part, except for like the yacht one or the train one that Lian Li made. There are a lot of options at 300 plus, and the 7000X just doesn't bring enough to the table to really be worth it. You're sacrificing function in the 7000X for sake of aesthetics, which is something that we are always going to be biased against. That's one of our biases as reviewers. Patrick and I are both very performance-oriented, very function-oriented, and that means we will review things more positively and value-oriented when they perform well given a price. So you don't gain enough from the 7000X for that, in our opinions. Now, it's more expensive. It has some additional features: tempered glass, RGB LEDs, Commander Core XT, fan and lighting controller. Things that we just don't really care about. Maybe some of you do. Cool, go for it. But we don't like that one, so wouldn't recommend it. Case here, 7000D Airflow, it's built well. It is excessive, and it's large. So again, the competitors are O11 XL from Lian Li, Fractal Meshify 2 XL, and probably the Phanteks Enthoo Pro 2. We've reviewed all of those on the channel if you want to see the individual reviews. But if you really want this one for a specific reason, the build quality is good despite some of the excessive materials involved, and that's about as good as it gets from us as a review. So that's it for this one. Value is the biggest problem here. Otherwise, it's okay. Corsair's is not as impressive to us as 4000D, but Corsair's still keeping a good path right now compared to where it was a couple years ago. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more as always. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to buy one of our mouse mats, which are in stock and shipping at the time of this video going up, or one of our mod mats. And you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus for extra. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.